Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're about to join us for Triangulation. San Francisco has just become the first city to institute an outright ban on facial recognition technology, and Brian Hofer was pivotal to the drafting and implementation of that ban. Today, we'll discuss the state of facial recognition technology, the tough factors in the balance in considering its use, civil liberties, and tech tool mission creep, all this and more in our discussion on Triangulation.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 400, recorded May 31st, 2019. Brian Hofer on facial recognition and surveillance technologies. This episode of Triangulation is brought to you by the Intrazone podcast from Microsoft, your biweekly conversation and interview podcast about SharePoint, OneDrive, and related tech within Microsoft 365. Get highlights on usage, adoption, and how SharePoint works for you. Subscribe on your favorite podcatcher today. Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and you're joining us for Triangulation. As usual on this wonderful show, we have a wonderful guest, and I'm so excited to have a nice, lengthy chat with Brian Hofer, who is the chair and executive director of Secure Justice and the driving force behind a new ordinance in San Francisco, which makes San Francisco the first city in the United States to ban facial recognition technology. Hi, Brian. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Denise. I really appreciate it.
We really appreciate you taking the time to get together with us and talk about your work and career and everything you've been up to for the past 5+ years when you started out in Oakland doing this kind of work. First of all, let's talk about you. Let's get some of your background. You've gone to law school. You were or still are a paralegal, is that right?
Right, still are.
Still are, and maybe someday you'll take the bar, but you've postponed that for a bit because you've gotten very deep into working on drafting ordinances all about transparency in the realm of facial recognition technology. How did you decide to pursue that particular line of work?
It was completely random. Definitely did not see this path for myself. I went to law school real late, and a gentleman by the name of Edward Snowden hit the newspapers in June of 2013. In July the next month, a mass surveillance project in Oakland kind of came to the forefront. It's called the Domain Awareness Sensor. It was a joint project with the city and the Port of Oakland. It was going to have facial recognition software, license plate readers, 700 plus cameras throughout schools and traffic corridors, data sharing with federal agencies. And it was ostensibly for, first responder purposes, public safety purposes. But once the journalists and citizen activists started digging into the project via public record requests, it was actually pretty informative what we didn't find. There was no mention of crime fighting. You didn't find words like homicide or rape or burglary or even like fire prevention or earthquakes or other public safety concerns. What you did find was discussions about Occupy. You might recall Occupy Oakland was pretty big, probably second to New York. It didn't end so well. And it caused, a lot of concern in the city of Oakland. And that's why we think this project was the genesis of that mass surveillance proposal. I didn't find out about that project until 2014. I had been working at a civil litigation firm, just got done with kind of a nasty trial, and I pick up this East Bay Express cover story that really illustrated all the public record research that had been going on in 2013, and I was just stunned. No one in my circle of friends knew that it existed. The local media wasn't covering it other than the East Bay Express. no one in my professional circle knew this thing was going on. And, meanwhile, the whole time Edward Snowden had been revealing more and more as the year went by. There was a little sidebar in that newspaper to the main article that said there's this newly formed group called Oakland Privacy, and they were meeting to oppose this project, and the meeting just happened to be the very next day. So I showed up just see if I could maybe plug in, or really just to kind of learn and see what was going on. And folks weren't too organized. There was discussions of a lot of like kind of street theater, street tactics. And when the conversation kind of got quiet, I asked how many city council members they had met with, and the whole room just went quiet. They hadn't met with anyone, the actual people voting on the project. And so I was actually a bit frustrated. I got up to leave, and then a couple people, sort of convinced me to stay and said, let's develop a strategy. If you want to, meet with the council, then, go put on your suit and tie and you can handle that. And so that's what I actually started doing. It was the first time, I think at that point I'd lived in Oakland for 15 years, and I had never walked inside City Hall for any reason. I was like literally the guy that just walked in off the couch. I had never talked to elected officials in a substantive manner, in a formal setting. I had never spoken at a city council meeting. And we just showed up and started talking, saying we had concerns about this project, trying to educate them, which was definitely necessary. The staff reports were very thin, did not reveal much information, and started coalition building. We were able to delay. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's just wonderful, and somehow you went from the guy off the couch who wandered in to start talking with the elected officials to the guy who was drafting what they were eventually going to pass. How did that take place?
Yeah, fast forward, we were able to oppose the Domain Awareness Center successfully, and they set up an ad hoc privacy committee that I was appointed to start drafting privacy policies. The city of Oakland didn't have any in place at that time. And we were able to convince the city council to turn it into a standing privacy committee. We're the first one in the country that has oversight of surveillance equipment. And out of that is when I really started working with other jurisdictions. That was kind of the launching pad. It was pretty perfect timing for our purposes that the ACLU in, I believe it was November 2014, came out with their model surveillance ordinance, CCOPS, which is Community Control Over Policing Surveillance. It's a vetting framework. It's a transparency ordinance. That's what was just passed in San Francisco. We now have 7 of these on the books around the Greater Bay Area. I've co-authored 5 of them. And we've pretty much had the same coalition. We've got a good 30, 35 organizations that hasn't lost a vote in 5 years. We've been able to educate the electeds effectively. We've been able to garner public support and get media attention. And luckily, in the Bay Area, where we have good progressive leaders that understand these concerns and, firsthand understand this technology, because we're the ones creating it out here in the Bay Area, we've been able to regulate it effectively.
Yeah, the acronym you mentioned, CCOPS, is a good hashtag to look up on Twitter or elsewhere if you want more information about that model ACLU ordinance. Are there differences between, did you say it's 7 jurisdictions in the Bay Area? Have they all pretty much adopted the same thing, or are there slight differences?
There's definitely slight difference. Each jurisdiction's a little different, and just the political reality as you make compromises, but they all follow the same model. There's obviously a difference with Santa Clara and San Francisco County because there's a district attorney and sheriff, whereas our other jurisdictions are, cities or BART, a transit district, where they have direct control over their police department. So there are some little nuances here and there. What made San Francisco unique is that for the first time, the ACLU threw in a prohibition. So the model does not prohibit any technology. It really just forces everything out into the open so that we can have a discussion. Oakland, for example, had a Stingray, a cell phone tracker, for 10 years before we found out about it. So, of course, there was no policy, there was no regulation, because we didn't even know it existed. So that's the genius of this model, is that every single equipment, use, or acquisition has to come out for a public discussion and vetting. But this is the first time, and I think it was just really because of the time that we're in, not only with Donald Trump, but just the fast spread of facial surveillance in the private sector. I think this is the first time our coalition said, you know what, we need to draw a line here, because we still have a chance on the government side, those with police power, to keep the genie in the bottle. And so that's the big difference in San Francisco, is that, and especially I want to recognize Supervisor Peskin, who carried this ordinance, his legislative aide Lee Hepner, who really helped us get across the finish line, and Matt Cagle from the ACLU really helped drive this across to what's been a national headline-grabbing victory.
Right. If folks are interested in learning more, for example, about Brian's career, there's a whole profile on him in the New York Times as the result of the ordinance that was just enacted in San Francisco that takes it past mere transparency, which I am assuming from what you're saying, Brian, is where the other Bay Area jurisdictions have gone, so that you wouldn't have in one of those jurisdictions a situation where a Stingray was operating and there's no public disclosure of that. San Francisco now has that, but also a ban on the use of facial recognition technology until the Board of Supervisors decides to lift that ban, I suppose, correct?
I mean, any ordinance can be amended. I mean, that's always a possibility. Any law is only as strong as the people that are going to advocate for it and hold elected officials accountable. So, yes, we do need to remain vigilant that it doesn't go backwards. Oakland and Berkeley are now considering the exact same language. I took the language from the ACLU draft and brought it through our Privacy Commission in Oakland, and where it received unanimous support, and it's now going through the committee process. And Berkeley also is seeking to amend their existing ordinance with the same language.
So was this a tough call for you and the supervisors that you worked with and got on board with this plan in San Francisco to decide that, and you can walk us through the thought process behind the ban, but what I'm assuming the thought process, at least partially involved, was yes, there are law enforcement benefits to using facial recognition technology to apprehend criminals, but this technology is not yet ready for prime time. There are huge bias issues that academicians have determined have not been solved. And we just don't want it here because it's not working the way that ideally one would want it to work if what its purpose is to fairly deter crime. Have I encapsulated that at all?
Yeah,
closely?
So we made two arguments, and it's a very delicate position for an elected official to be in. I have immense respect for all the weight that is on these people's shoulders. Just because you're a supervisor doesn't mean you're immune from the same pressures that are hitting the police department. When there's a violent crime or a mass shooting, something terrible, these elected officials are going to hear about it from their constituents directly. And that's the one thing about local politics, there's nowhere to hide. You were going to hear from the voters. So they had to make a couple calculations. The first one, I think, is the easy one. it is definitely not ready for prime time when the error rate is as high as 35% if you're a Black woman. Oakland, that's an easy sell. Oakland's been under federal monitoring for 16 consecutive years. Federal courts have found us guilty of racial profiling. We get sued left and right every single year because we just cannot stay out of trouble. So to give them this type of tool with that type of error rate would just be a huge legal financial liability. That's the easy part of the calculation. The hard part is long term. We acknowledge, and I would think probably unanimously in our coalition, we all acknowledge this technology is going to be perfect. It will get better with machine learning, greater data sets. It'll eventually figure out skin tone and gender. Technology marches on. We have no doubt of that. We also are not going to pretend that there aren't good use cases. Identifying a mass shooter and a violent criminal, looking at mugshots of people where we definitely already know there's a criminal predicate, maybe they're even in custody. We understand that can happen. Any tool can be used for good or for bad. We acknowledge that, and we're not attempting to hide it. This is different. I love what Alvaro Bedoya from Georgetown says, that this isn't normal. It's creepy. It can be done remotely at a distance. We don't even know what's happening. It is the most radical shift in power between the government and the governed. And for the electeds, where I've had difficulty talking to them, they come up with these good hypotheticals, like an active shooter case. And what I have so far been successfully convincing them of is it never stops there. There's always mission creep. Any tool that's this versatile will get used for multiple purposes. When license plate readers were first introduced, we were told that they're just to go get stolen vehicles recovered. Now they're used for every criminal investigation. They're used in civil investigations. They're used for administrative purposes. They're used all the time. It's ubiquitous. And that's the reality, is that if a tool can be used in different ways, it will be. So if we crack the bottle, crack the door open right now and let this technology be used in limited purposes, it's only a short matter of time until it gets used in other ways. And history has shown that there are no friendly case studies of mass surveillance, none. No matter what type of government, what time period, mass surveillance is always abused. And we also know that surveillance impacts certain communities more than others. It's never equally harmful. And that's the concern. Is the long-term concern is that it will be perfect surveillance. We won't be able to hide. I think our First Amendment protections would be obliterated.
So I'm sure one thing that you've encountered and that you've had to respond in the way that you just did is the case of the Capitol Gazette shooter last year. He was a person who went in and shot up a newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland. The offices there, the most deadly domestic attack on the press since 9/11. And he was apprehended through facial recognition technology. So that has to be the poster child, or at least one of them, case for why a city might want to have these kinds of measures in place. So he was not going to give himself up. He was only apprehended through this technology. I suppose other sort of police investigative techniques might have eventually apprehended him, but it wouldn't have been as quick. What is your response to a lawmaker who comes to you and says, we want to have that kind of assurance that we can catch these people too?
Yeah, I think the premise that he could have only been caught that way is unproven. Other police methods could have worked. We've seen a couple other cases like out here where they say, oh, facial recognition solved it. And once you actually dig into it, it was eyewitness testimony and old-fashioned police work. Again, we acknowledge that there will be success cases like this, there could be future success cases. I absolutely acknowledge that. We have to look at the overall big picture. on net, what is the impact going to be of allowing those with police power to have this technology? And that's, again, when I go back, we keep saying we don't have amnesia. All of human history has shown that mass surveillance gets abused. I can't detach myself from my face. At least a license plate reader, I can get out of a car. I can try to find an alternate mode of transportation. I can't separate myself from my face. As a condition of participating in my life, just going about my daily activities, I should not have to be subject to mass surveillance by walking outside my door. And that is where it's going to lead. We never used less surveillance. We never used less technology. The trend is always greater use. And so by allowing it in these little, narrow uses, which, again, of course we should try to identify active shooters. We're not saying criminals should not be apprehended or that police should be forced to blind themselves. But when you look at the big picture, what is the impact to society going to be? It is on net, it's going to be harmful. We have never seen a technology this powerful be entrusted to those with police power over our lives.
So I think that you've hit on already today, and I'd like to drill down a little further on the fact that it's not just the facial recognition technology that is the problem here. It's when you marry it up with all the rest of the surveillance technology that's available and active in society today. The license plate readers, the cell phone tower location gathering capabilities, the Real ID Act. How is that going to impact? It will take effect next year, and states will be issuing these real IDs where, they are taking further steps to match up people's and verify and vet people's identity, and then have their photos in a statewide database that will be accessible to law enforcement. How do all those additional factors play in?
Yeah, that's the big picture concern, is that there is so much surveillance already in play. We certainly don't need more of it, and something as radical as face surveillance. And when you combine it with the private sector's data mining tools, you can see the potential for abuse. We don't have to look that far back into our history to see how IBM worked with the Nazi government to analyze census data. This was data collected for an innocuous purpose, benign, and then it was used by people that wanted to target and harm folks. Already, the federal government is amassing large biometric databases on us. Most of us already have our face inside a photo of our face in a database somewhere. They're collecting DNA and fingerprints, and they want to do even more of that. Airports are now starting to force biometric collection, and it's you can just see. I think this is fairly obvious to anyone how much potential there is for abuse here. There's also, I think, a problem that doesn't quite get highlighted enough. What do you do if you lose your biometric data or if it gets hacked? I recently saw a demonstration. Our ears are actually one of our most unique features. Most people think like fingerprints or retina. Our ears are actually one of our most unique identifiers. And they were able to take a photo off Facebook, a side shot of somebody's profile, use a 3D printer to scan this person's ear, and they were able to beat a biometric system with it. What do you do at that point? So it's this full-on rush to collect all this data. Between both the public and private surveillance that's already out there, that is definitely the cause for alarm.
So one of the it wasn't funny for you, but one of the funniest things that I encountered in prepping for today's show is serendipitously, you, of all people, were one of the people who got stopped by law enforcement driving a rental car and accused of having stolen that rental car. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. I mean, I try to laugh now. It is terrifying when you have 4 guns at your head.
Dear Lord.
So my little brother and I, my little brother, he just graduated from UC Berkeley last week. We were going home for the Thanksgiving holiday to go visit our parents. He lives with me here in Oakland. And I rent his car, we drive home fine. We drive back on the exact same freeway, which I still don't understand. They have all these stationary license plate reader scanners, so I don't know why it didn't ping me on the drive up. But anyway, we're driving home the Sunday after Thanksgiving. A Contra Costa County deputy gets behind me, tails us for a little bit, turns on his lights, directs us to get off the freeway. We pull into a shopping center. 3 more vehicles come and pin us in, and nobody really says anything. They're just kind of sitting there. And finally, one of the deputies out, kind of goes, "Hey, I guess you know what's going on." And I'm like, "Absolutely not. Like, it'd be great if you check my ID or ask some questions." And I turned on all the lights, turned off the car. Anyway, they make us, kind of do the backwards perp walk out of our respective sides of the car. They handcuff me, put me in the back of one of the deputies' vehicles. They get my little brother out of the other side, and this deputy just goes crazy on him. He pushes my brother to his knees. So keep in mind, he's facing away from the sheriff with his hands behind his head, totally compliant, no threat at all. And he pushes my brother to his knees, puts a gun against the back of his head, executioner style, and then throws him. Yeah, and I'm watching this. I mean, it's right in front of me. It's like, I don't know, 10 yards away, something like that, right in front of me. Throws him forward on his face. He wears glasses. He was defenseless and, screwed up his glasses. Then they handcuff him, put him in the back of the other police car. And after a little, and then they illegally search the whole car. They open the doors, open a trunk, open our suitcases. It's just clothes, nothing there. They finally come to check our IDs. And they say the car has been reported stolen, and it was pinged by the license plate reader. And as I'm sitting in the back of the deputy's car, I see a screen by Vigilant Solutions, which is one of the more popular makers of license plate readers. And I know because I chase them around because they do business with ICE. So I'm constantly fighting Vigilant. Anyway, so they run our IDs, they call the rental company, confirm it's an active rental. Oh yeah, they forced me to give my passcode over on my phone. I refused, and they told me I had no choice because I was just going to show them, the rental stuff on my phone on the application. So they forced me to give over my passcode. Anyway, they confirmed it as a rental. They released us after about, 40, 45 minutes. And then they tried to blame everything on another police agency, San Jose. I guess the car had been stolen in the past, and it was recovered. I mean, obviously, because I had rented it. And no one ever cleared it from the hot list. So now we're in the middle of a lawsuit against all these parties because obviously civil liberties, civil rights violations, but also just negligence. So yeah,
what a
dramatic.
terrible thing for you and your brother to have to go through. And I think it really, for those who consider the factors here and weigh all the factors of, should we, and this wasn't even facial recognition technology, but it could have been. You could find yourself in that kind of scenario, I think, even more readily if some biometric of yours matched up with a biometric of an accused and wanted killer, for example. And it was a false positive. So I think it really helps bring home, why you do the work that you do, why you think it's important, and how those factors balance out. Yes, we want law enforcement to be apprehending the right suspects and charging the right people. And if they're, a little broad in their reach, maybe that's a price we're willing to pay to get the right person, because the justice system will suss out and protect those who are temporarily brought into contact with it as part of that investigation, but shouldn't be there. But if you're going to be that person and you're going to have to watch your brother
Yeah.
thrown on the ground and have his glasses broken, it's disturbing. Or be the person who's got their face in the ground. And you just based on what I can see of you today, you might have gotten it easier than someone of color who was in that situation. So it's definitely high risk stuff that we're dealing with. Let me ask you if you think that there's a role for consent in all of this. One of the things that you've worked on, aside from just the ban we talked about earlier, is transparency. So we have communities where there's going to be a lot of information about the surveillance mechanisms in use by law enforcement, and I assume elsewhere. Do the ordinances, the ACLU ordinance and the ones that are modeled on it, encompass the fact that there are going to be private surveillance technologies in use as well that law enforcement can access?
So where the ordinance stretches to private parties is through data sharing arrangements. The burden and the real focus is on government employees, whatever jurisdiction that the ordinance applies to. It controls city or county departments, their agents. But obviously to preclude, just outsourcing of surveillance, there is a oversight component in the regulations that would pertain to data sharing. So I can't just say, oh, we'll just get all our, facial recognition through Ring doorbell or Amazon, or we're just going to go outsource everything to Vigilant Solutions. If you're going to receive that data or request it, then there is also parts of the ordinance that would apply to that.
Okay, so back to my consent question. Do you feel like there's a way that citizens can give meaningful consent to the technologies that are being used by law enforcement, whether directly by them or through private parties that they're sharing data with?
Consent requires that you be fully informed. And I can tell you firsthand that no one is. The average public citizen has no idea what's going on. And I can tell you 100% of the elected officials I've met with do not understand the item or proposal that is in front of them. Most of the surveillance equipment stuff, like when I first got started, everything was on a consent calendar, which means it's considered non-controversial, ceremonial. There's no discussion. It's just a big mass motion where they approve a lot of, minor innocuous items. And that's where the Domain Awareness Center was. A $12 million system with facial recognition software originally was on the consent calendar. They just tried to slide it through under the radar. So it does, is consent important? Of course. I mean, that's what the point of the CCOPS model is, that each community gets to decide for themselves where to draw the lines. Like, yes, we're comfortable with this use. Yes, we're comfortable with this amount of data retention or this third-party data sharing. That's the whole point. But inherent in that model is that you get these full, robust impact statements, so you can actually see the concerns, that you have to have adequate notice and public input into the use policy to mitigate the concerns, that there's an ongoing annual reporting requirement so that the user has to demonstrate that they're using the equipment appropriately. So without those components, consent is meaningless. And outside of this model, I've never seen that happen. The easiest part of the Domain Awareness Center fight was picking apart the staff reports. There was no information in them. So when we go to the electeds and say, hey, look, we actually pulled down the manufacturer's manuals and look what this technology can do, they would fall out of their chair, because they had no idea what this stuff could do. When you would show them Oakland Police Department's license plate reader database, like they actually produced it via public record request. Ars Technica did a great study of it. And Sarus Farivar, the author, went and showed one of the council members what he had found. He goes, hey, is this where you live? And the guy was stunned. He couldn't believe that you could figure out where he lived just based on these, seemingly random, disparate data points. So, yes, look, we're all turning over data to Facebook and Instagram. We're voluntarily doing that. Did we know that Facebook was sending it to Cambridge Analytica? No. Did we know that, they were sending it to all these other advertisers when they were publicly stating they weren't? No. So consent to me today has become somewhat meaningless because you're never making an informed decision outside of this model that we've been working on.
Right. Okay. So let's assume though that they're in these cities or jurisdictions in Northern California where you've had success in enacting these things, and there is information available. Do you think that and the cities, let's say one of them decides to forge ahead and have a pretty aggressive surveillance program in use by its local law enforcement? Do you think it's meaningful that people would be able to have this information and then vote with their rent or their mortgage or their feet and leave? Do you think that that's actually something people would do?
I think where economic situations allow folks to have that freedom, sure. Here in the Bay Area, there's nowhere to go. Nobody could afford to live, as it is today. There's no housing. California has a housing problem throughout the whole state. So, that's a very difficult decision to be able to make. I think when the pain point becomes high enough that folks will make that decision. It's kind of that frog in the frying pan analogy. It's like if you just slowly turn up the heat, the frog doesn't notice. And that's what I think has happened with a lot of surveillance, is that we didn't notice. Partly because it was being concealed from us, or it slid under the radar on a consent calendar. But, it's only sort of now, and I really think it was, Edward Snowden pulling the curtain, off and showing us the Wizard of Oz behind that. It's like, hey, there's actually a lot of bad stuff that's been going on for decades. We've been seeing pieces of it here and there, and now it's kind of coming to a head, and we have this critical mass pushing back. It's not just the Bay Area, and it's not just the CCOPS model. A lot of states have regulated stingrays or drones or license plate readers. Some have outlawed license plate readers completely. There is a critical mass of pushback now from people. And again, I think, to get back to your consent question, I think it's because we are becoming more informed. And when we're more informed, so far, people are making the correct decision. We could consent to full-on ubiquitous mass surveillance, sure. I'm hoping we don't. I'm hoping that people are smart enough and strong enough not to do that and to see the risks, but Americans are great at forgetting history. They do collectively have amnesia, so that is always a concern. But that's why we're out there highlighting these risks. And so far, once people get this amount of information, they usually make the right decision.
I am so enjoying this conversation, and I have so many more questions for you, Brian, about what this means on the national level and various and sundry other things I want to get into. But we do need to thank our sponsor for this episode of Triangulation is brought to you by The Intrazone, which is a podcast from Microsoft. The Intrazone is your biweekly conversation and interview podcast about SharePoint, OneDrive, and related tech within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. Get the most out of SharePoint and learn how it works for you. Each episode covers important topics and information about Microsoft SharePoint, including news and announcements, a focused topic of the week, guest perspectives from various experts, users, partners, and customers, a partner highlight where they'll feature a partner from their strong ecosystem, frequently asked questions roundtable, upcoming events, conferences, and workshops, and more. You'll learn how to more easily share and manage content and empower teamwork throughout your organization with the technology you already have. And be sure to check out the latest episode with Jeff Teeper, Microsoft's VP for Office 365, OneDrive, and SharePoint. This was done live from SharePoint's recent conference, and you'll hear how SharePoint is turbocharging user experiences, the importance of design, and some big announcents that were made, plus a whole lot more. Be sure to check out their latest episodes at aka.ms/theintrazone and subscribe to the Intrazone wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to the Intrazone today. That's the Intrazone, INTRAZONE. Thank you so much, the Intrazone, for your support of Triangulation. We're here with Brian Hofer, who is the chair and executive director of Secure Justice. He's been very active in Northern California, most recently in San Francisco, which has passed an ordinance prohibiting facial recognition technology, in addition to mandating transparency around surveillance technologies. One of the things that you've touched on today that we haven't really gotten into is the fact that you've also done work on behalf of cities in Northern California, jurisdictions in Northern California, concerning private parties that are working with facial recognition technologies and selling that technology to various law enforcement agencies. Tell us about that.
Well, I've worked on a model ordinance that sort of, I would call it an economic boycott. What we're doing, and it's not limited to facial recognition. If you supply data, extreme analytics, and we define analytics, which would include facial recognition, or detention facility support to federal immigration agencies, you're not eligible for a municipal contract. This is not, an original idea. It's been done with the Trump's border wall in the old 70s and 80s. We had anti-nuclear weapons prohibitions around here in the Bay Area. So I basically followed that same model. Just applied it to a new target. Once Donald Trump was elected, and intentionally started targeting sanctuary cities, and California specifically, Oakland specifically by name, is when I realized that. We were talking earlier about the CCOPS model and the data sharing component. It wasn't going quite far enough to what we were kind of calling a digital sanctuary. Like California is a sanctuary state, and we have sanctuary cities, but it was really just words. And as we've seen with World War II, as I referenced earlier, both the U.S. and Nazi governments were using census data to target people. So when we have, behemoths like Palantir, Thomson Reuters, and then you have other companies like Vigilant Solutions, which sell their license plate reader database, which has billions of scans to ICE. We saw that we needed another tool to protect the people in our communities. And so that model ordinance has been passed in Richmond, Berkeley, and Oakland. It kind of got going in the assembly. Assemblymember Bonta carried it for our coalition. It's not going to make it this year, and we hope to attempt it next year. As you can imagine, the tech opposition was pretty severe. But that's what we're trying to do, is use the power of the purse. Directly head-on regulating private parties and private behavior is very difficult. And there could also be some, freedom of speech issues there that we might start infringing on. So we have to walk a very fine line when it comes to private parties. And this was, to me, a much better solution at trying to change those behaviors without sort of interfering with other rights that they might possess.
So we start talking about this as, okay, we're going to have these cities and of course the whole state of California squaring off against the administration on this issue of sanctuary status and working with ICE and other law enforcement agencies that would be, working on the other side of that controversy. This starts to sound like a political issue, a partisan political issue. And I'm wondering what you think about that. There was just a hearing in Washington where the coverage of it has described it as a rare show of bipartisan unity breaking out over the issue of facial recognition software. Present at the hearing were various Republicans and Democrats, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is just a lightning rod these days as far as representing the far left end of the political spectrum. But then you have Representative Mark Meadows, who is a Republican from North Carolina, who characterized that hearing as hitting the sweet spot that brings progressives and conservatives together. He said, when you have a diverse group on this committee, as diverse as you might see on the polar ends, I'm here to tell you we're serious about this, and let's get together and work on legislation. So against that context, I'm kind of curious where you see this whole issue of surveillance by law enforcement and by private companies whose databases can be used by law enforcement in the political milieu.
Yeah, so if I heard your first question correctly, I mean, is there a spat between Trump and California? Of course. I'm not involved in that. I mean, it certainly exists. I mean, President Obama deported more people than Trump has so far. I would argue Obama expanded the surveillance state more than Trump has. So to me, it's kind of irrelevant who's in the White House. Both parties are abusing power, and we're trying to fight that. More specifically to why is this issue getting bipartisan support? Again, quoting Alvaro from Georgetown, like, it's creepy. I think that, this is so radical that people are finally understanding collectively, like, we've got to draw a line. You talk about consent and, can people just consent to do these things? We could also say no, like, that is an option. And I think that's why the Domain Awareness Center, generated international headlines, because no one had ever successfully opposed a surveillance project before, not in that manner, not that large. And, people, we were this rare unicorn, and that's what caught everybody's attention. And that's sad. This is a democracy. We have the ability to say, no, we don't approve of something. And I think, and maybe it's just because it's your face, it's more intimate and such. It's not speculative. It's a concrete, tangible thing for you to understand. Face surveillance is the most dangerous technology that humanity has faced this far, and we've already seen the harm from the error rate, and we know that there will be a harm from mass surveillance.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions for you on that. First is the state of privacy law as we deal with it today. Privacy laws have evolved with this concept that if you're out in public, you really have very little privacy. You can be photographed, you can be videoed, and you're out there in public. You've put yourself out there. It's kind of like the concept of what we were discussing earlier. Do you really have to live in that city that you live in? Do you have the flexibility to move if you don't like its policies? Do you really have the flexibility not to go out in public? Well, most of us don't. But as privacy laws today stand, you have very little privacy being out in public, and you are supposed to be informed about that, and you are supposed to know that when you're out there, you're kind of fair game. Do you think that privacy law in general needs to shift given the kinds of technologies that we're discussing here today?
I actually think we probably have pretty sufficient laws on the books already. At the high level, U.S. Supreme Court law that would, bind the whole nation, that often takes time to catch up to the rest of the country, just, by the nature of the process itself. But I think we've got sufficient protections. What we need to change is our messaging. When I was part of Oakland Privacy, we actually considered a name change because privacy it's too limiting. When you say, oh, you go outside of public, the standard is I have no reasonable expectation of privacy. That's not, this 100% dispositive notion. When I go out, I do have a privacy interest in my locational data, in my associations, my travel patterns, the house of worship I go to, the doctor that I go to. I might want some of my communications confidential when I'm out in public. I might be standing off in a corner whispering. That's certainly the courts have recognized that I have an expectation of privacy. So just because I'm outside my house doesn't mean my privacy interests evaporate. I firmly reject that notion. But our problem has been messaging. What I really like. My big sister during the Domain Awareness Center, Linda Lai, was a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, and she just got sworn in as a judge out here in Contra Costa County last week. She has really been pushing, and you've started to see it in Sotomayor's and others' opinions, the mosaic theory, that independently, a certain data point might not be harmful, and it might not infringe my privacy interests, or at least not beyond a reasonable amount. But the collection of all these data points is totally different, and it's new to the modern era in data mining and the analytics that we now have. That the collection of all these disparate data points allows us now to see what we couldn't see before with the naked eye. Or Scalia would talk about the little policeman that just follows you around is obviously not the same as a GPS tracker attached to your car collecting on your data for a month at a time. That type of data harvesting, essentially unlimited memory that computers have, and the speed of the processors, now you could really quickly, with freely available open data sources like Google or Yelp or what's public on Facebook, you can figure out almost anything about people. Jonathan Mayer did a famous study while he was still a student at Stanford Law School and getting a double major in computer science. He built an app. You remember when Edward Snowden first came out about the NSA said, oh, it's just metadata. There's no harm. It's just the to and the from and the number dialed. You can't figure anything out. So Jonathan built an app and had some friends test it out. He was able to figure out who had an abortion, who had a marijuana grow house, who was stockpiling firearms, who had cancer, based only on free, open, public information. It's very revealing. And that's why, I hate, and I just firmly reject this, oh, if you have nothing to hide, you don't have anything to fear. I have something to protect, right? That's what Edward Snowden said so beautifully. I have something to protect. You shouldn't know everything about me. It gives you too much power over my life, whether you're a private party trying to market me or you're a police government. You would have to be crazy to not say Donald Trump is authoritarian. This type of technology and that type of power from data mining gives immense potential for abuse.
So Beatmaster in IRC has a good question, and it prompts me to get a little bit into the weeds and details about the specific ordinances that we're talking about in Northern California and San Francisco. His question is about limiting the length of data retention. You would have a requirement that things be deleted after a certain amount of months or maybe years. Is that involved in any of the ACLU's model ordinances or in anything that you've recently worked toward in Northern California?
Yes. So the impact statement, so there's two documents required for every proposal. An anticipated impact statement where you're supposed to address the potential impact to civil liberties and our privacy interests. And then there's a proposed use policy that hopefully, ideally, mitigates those concerns that you just raised in the impact statement. So there's an enumerated requirement in both of those documents is that you specify your proposed data retention and you justify it. You have to, the burden is on the proponent to say, I need to keep license plate reader data for 60 days because of X, Y, Z. Now, because this is a new model, this has been the most lacking part of the documents we've seen so far. I can tell you today that if anybody stands in front of you and says, I know with certainty the exact sweet spot for data retention, they're lying. no one knows because no one's been tracking this stuff. I'm currently in the middle of a research project with some UC Berkeley data scientists trying to see what Bay Area police departments have been doing. Just trying to figure out how often they are querying their systems and figure out the date ranges where they get the most bang for their buck. Because out here, we're seeing anything from 30 days to, Oakland used to keep data for 5 years. And when I asked the chief, have you ever used that old stuff? He goes, no. So why are we retaining it? It's a risk. It's a cost to the taxpayer. Storage is getting expensive, and if there's no need for it, why take it? Why take any risk? Just get rid of it. So there is definitely a burden on them to justify their proposed data retention.
You've been working on the very, very local level with this hearing we were just discussing before the House Oversight Committee, and apparent agreement across political lines about the hazards of widespread use of facial recognition technology. Are you optimistic about Washington doing anything about this anytime soon?
I'm confident they will do something. And am I optimistic it will be the right thing? No. I hope they do, and I'll certainly lend any expertise or help or public pressure that I can. But, every time something moves up a level, if it's from local to state to federal, the lobbyists just attack it. Illinois has a wonderful statute which really harmed Facebook's model about the collection of biometric data, their Facebook photos. And while Facebook is out there publicly saying how privacy friendly they are, they're spending millions of dollars lobbying to get that bill. And that's the same thing that's going to happen at the federal level. These guys want federal preemption because, and when I say these guys, the vendors want federal preemption because they know that their combined purchasing power will get weakened legislation, and that'll knock out our stronger local efforts. And that's why we're trying to work as fast as possible at the local level, a grassroots movement to hopefully put up enough pressure going upstream that we get something better than realistically I think we're going to get.
One of the things about that committee hearing that is worth mentioning, people may remember, I think it was last year when the ACLU tested some of the Amazon technology we've been touching on here today, Amazon's Rekognition, spelled with a K, and found that 28 members of Congress were misidentified as people who had committed a crime. It's worth noting that 3 of those misidentified congresspeople were on this oversight committee that we're recently discussing this issue. And going back to your mention of the Ars Technica piece where the local lawmaker was shown, hey, we can find out all this about you. That seems to be a real effective way to make a point.
Yeah, my understanding that was Jake Snow out of the ACLU Northern California, and it was brilliant. Mm-hmm. It was brilliant because it makes that pain point personal. And that's, again, like I said, when we need to start changing our messaging, that's what we need to do. I don't know if you ever saw that hilarious John Oliver interview with Edward Snowden, and I'm not going to get into the graphic details of it, but it's, there needs to be a personal pain point. People need to understand how they themselves can be harmed from this type of surveillance in order to really take it seriously. Because I think most folks, again, not being informed, they think it's speculative or that it's, it's too remote.
I didn't see that, and I'm going to go look it up because it sounds fascinating. What did Snowden do to John Oliver?
I'll just say that the personal pain point they were referring to was a certain, it was photos of a certain part of of my anatomy, a man's anatomy. So we'll just go watch it. It'll make sense.
All right. Yeah. We all have our homework after this. Yeah. Okay. Wanted to talk. Well, I guess my sort of stage setting question for you is, you mentioned earlier, you think that there will be a time when facial recognition technology is perfected, when it doesn't have false positives, when everyone is accurately identified all the time and quickly. When that has happened, Will you embrace it for use by law enforcement? What parameters would have to be in place?
None. And
None.
that's, I'm already getting asked that question as we're working with lobbying the Oakland City Council as they're considering this prohibition. They're coming up with the same good hypotheticals that I described earlier, like active shooters and, these types of things. I acknowledge that. This is really a philosophical discussion, and I've publicly stated, I've privately stated, I've pinned myself down that any tool can be used for good or for bad. And I believe that. I believe that with facial recognition. The problem is it is so versatile, it will never just stop with one or two specific uses or three or four. It will never stop. People are ignoring history. Mission creep is reality. It always happens. It happens with all the other surveillance equipment. So to some, that's one, I love this country, but I really hate this sort of, American exceptionalism belief that, we're going to be the ones to contradict all of human history and handle mass surveillance responsibly. Nothing in our past supports that, and it's just not reality. This technology, if it is allowed to get out, if it is allowed to be used by the police, will be used for a great number of purposes. It might not start out that way in year 1, but by year 5 or 10, it will, because you're going to say, oh, look how helpful it is in this situation. Oh, let's use it here. And and it's just going to keep expanding. That's just reality. So if you're totally comfortable with the government knowing everything about you and tracking you as you just leave your house every day 24/7, then fine, consent, because that is where this trail ends. It's not speculative. That is where this road ends. I am not comfortable with that type of balance of power shift between the government and the governed. And so even though there can be, are legitimate uses to this technology, I am rejecting its use outright because of the overall greater harm to our society. It is incompatible with a healthy democracy.
Where do you think the technology stands on that continuum of being not ready for prime time now, but close to perfection? I read an article, I think just this last week, about Yitu, if I'm saying that right, Yitu, which is a Shanghai-based company. Speaking of American exceptionalism, we can talk about facial recognition in China, that is touting that it can identify a person from a database of at least 2 billion people in a matter of seconds, and that it has this incredible rate of accuracy. Are you paying attention to this company, and what do you think?
Yeah, especially when you find out how many American researchers are over there and how many private American data brokers are selling their data to China. It's terrifying. I mean, we're already seeing the Chinese, target the Uyghurs, the Muslim population, based on facial characteristics. So we don't have to look very far to say, oh, this technology can be abused by a tyrannical government. It's already occurring. We have a tyrannical president. And maybe we're going to get rid of him in 2020. I hope so. But I don't want anybody to have this type of technology because that power is going to be abused. All of human history supports that. I don't know how far along we are until it's 100% perfect. The research I've been reading lately says the error rate halves every year. That's pretty darn fast progress. It's going to be really accurate really soon.
Right. Yeah, and I suppose it's not, as you mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter which administration is in power or who the president is. The systems are the systems, and they survive administrations. And they
exactly. Power never asks for less. It never retreats. It doesn't go back. We have to assert our rights and stand up, and that's why we're drawing this line here. It's never going to just voluntarily say, oh, we're going to use less surveillance. It's just not reality. And that's what people need to understand, is that if we don't push back, then we're just accepting more and more and more of what we've been getting. And I'm not comfortable with that.
So what do you think of these? Let's assume optimistically that the work you're doing spreads, and that the lawmakers in Washington take effective action, and that we take a different approach in the United States toward facial recognition technology. On balance, you're going to have communities and states and localities that decide with hopefully informed consent, that they want it, right? That they think this is going to make their communities safe. They're willing to live with the risks that and the inconvenience and the terror, as you were describing earlier, of being pulled over or brought into the scrutiny of law enforcement when you haven't actually done anything. There are going to be communities, maybe isolated, maybe not, who decide that that's the way they want to go. But let's assume for a moment that the U.S. on balance takes a different course than China. How do you see that playing out? If we have one model in one part of the world and a completely different model, it seems that China is going down.
Well, I used to think that, American practices would spread throughout the world when they showed themselves to be superior. And unfortunately, the current administration has burned a lot of bridges, ruined a lot of our standing in the world. And so I don't know how confident I am that those relationships are going to get repaired anytime soon. I think we would have to really firmly reject Trump in 2020 and just start unwinding all the damage that he's done. I would hope, and I do believe, when America has made good public and foreign policy decisions, that does spread throughout the world. I think there's a really significant portion of the motivation for a lot of foreign students to come to American universities is because of the freedom that they get to experience here and the opportunities that they're afforded. And they take that back to their countries after they graduate and go home and go start businesses elsewhere. And I think that some of those American ideals, those democratic ideals, do spread. So if America did make the right decision on this, I would hope it would reverberate around. But this current administration has done a lot of harm on that. We have a lot of work ahead of us to repair our standing in the world.
Well, and I guess that's where it does get back to my question about whether considering surveillance technologies or implementing them and how they're implemented, if it's political or not. It does seem like you might be more likely in a Republican administration to have a more law enforcement friendly, tough on crime kind of approach that would say, hey, we've got to give our hardworking members of law enforcement who are putting their lives on the line day in and day out for our safety. We have to give them every tool that is available to us for them to do their jobs effectively. So in that sense, I do think that we get into partisan politics on this, even if the Congress people on the oversight committee want to work together and make sure that we have a reasonable approach toward this new technology. What they kept talking about is putting on the brakes and assessing what's going on here. What if they do put on the brakes or they enact some kind of legislation that puts on the brakes? That doesn't mean that this won't continue to flourish, at least in the private sector, right?
Right. And I'm typically, I tend to be an incrementalist. I think that's why, we have an undefeated voting streak, now 27-0, is because, and that's obviously also the benefit of Bay Area elected officials supporting us, but it's, we haven't gone for, crazy outlandish ideas. We've taken very reasonable measured steps to get where we want to. And so that's why I think we've had, an undefeated streak. So in that incremental mindset, I'm in favor of anything that results in harm reduction. A moratorium would prevent harm reduction, in the immediate future. So that's better than nothing.
Right.
And a moratorium, I would support that. The problem, of course, is that's just going to give them time to perfect the technology. Then they're going to come back and say, look, now it's 100% accurate. You don't have to worry about the error rate and the racial profiling, et cetera. And we're just, all we did was really just kick the can down the road because the greater concern is still the mass surveillance. That's the big risk. We all know the technology is going to be perfected. So that's really just a short-term, immediate concern. The greater concern is the threat to our democracy. So a moratorium in that sense is just insufficient.
Okay, to begin to wrap up the show here, I want to throw it back to 2014, where we began the show, and the Bay Area, again, where we began the show. Across the Bay, though, in San Francisco, there was once a cafe/laundromat in San Francisco called Brainwash, where I myself used to do many a load of laundry and nosh on their delicious food in the late 80s, early 90s, when I had just gotten out of law school. And it turns out that Brainwash has been in the news lately. It doesn't exist any longer. It went out of business. It's a casualty of it couldn't afford its rent anymore in San Francisco. So I mourn everything about Brainwash, except the fact that in 2014, apparently, it was using its internal surveillance cameras, its webcams, to take a look at who was in Brainwash doing laundry and maybe having a beer, because they had a bar and a restaurant. And they gave that data over to researchers who used it to, it wound up actually being used by the National University of Defense Technology in China for 2 research projects on advancing the capabilities of object detection to more accurately isolate the target region in an image. That entity is controlled by China's top military body, the Central Military Commission. And the Brainwash data also appears in a 2018 research paper affiliated with MEGV Face++ that used images from Brainwash Cafe to validate the generalization ability of their crowd human data set for head detection. So have you taken a look at any of this, Brian, and what do you think about the Brainwash data?
Yeah, this was just mind-blowing to me. Getting back to consent and the whole reasonable expectation of privacy, I mean, this is, why we need greater enforcement of our rights, because, they're going to argue, it's like, hey, you walked into the store, you are presumed not to have an expectation of privacy. I can go sell your image wherever I want to. That's creepy. I mean, this is creepy. This should strike you as creepy, that your face was taken and given to unfriendly, tyrannical government that is actively targeting, if not committing real genocide, committing cultural genocide against the Muslim population. And they're using your face and your friends' faces to train their machines to do so. If that doesn't alarm you or concern you, then, nothing else that I'm going to be able to say is really going to reach you. This is just not good. I was reading about another one just the other day, Patron Scan. They're basically creating a no-fly list for people that have been kicked out of bars. So if you walk into bars, and this was up in Sacramento, and I guess they collected 10,000 faces in one day, started scanning people. And so then they let all the bars that participate, that are customers, know, like, essentially, who's on this unwanted list. There's no notices, there's no disclaimers going on. I don't want people knowing who I'm in a bar with all the time. Some of those are private or confidential conversations that I'm having. I might be off in a corner having a beer with an elected official talking about some confidential stuff. It's just creepy. I don't want to subject myself to this. And the willingness of people to just sell data for any purpose and not really care what the end user is doing is really mind-blowing to me. I mean, when we're seeing it writ large with Facebook and these other companies who their whole model is just to suck up as much data as possible to then go monetize that. But it's also a weapon. That data is a weapon, and in the wrong hands, it's going to do a lot of harm.
One of my favorite other podcasts these days is Katerina Fake's Should This Exist? And she actually was on this show not too long ago. And I think we've been doing a lot of Should This Exist today on facial recognition technology. It's basically what you've been doing for the last 5 years of your life, and trying to cast forward to foresee the bad uses that could come from a well-intentioned technology. I'd like to, at the end of the show here, flip that on its head a bit, Brian, and have you consider, if I can borrow from Katerina and her premise of her show, the should this exist ramifications of your work, and that hypothetical, terrible situation that something really bad happens in San Francisco. There's an awful terrorist act, death, destruction, and something that shocks us the way that 9/11 shocked the country, that could have been deterred had the city adopted a Y2 level of very accurate facial recognition technology. How are you going to feel about that?
I've only been asked, I think once at a conference, if I worry that my policies are too restrictive. And I definitely, I think, take a very measured approach when we're writing policies for equipment that we know is going to go out into the world. I do think I'm sufficiently informed. I live and breathe this stuff. I study it. I've studied history. I'm a history nerd. I read all this stuff. I agree that there could be a legitimate use in a situation like you describe. And how would I feel if the ordinance that I supported and advocated for prohibits its use? We have to draw the line somewhere. And we have very difficult decisions to make in our society, how we govern ourselves, how we establish due process, how we allow those with police power to act over our lives, to take away our liberties if we commit wrongdoing. I reject this notion that alternate methods won't be effective or can't work. We have not really ever needed technology like this throughout most of human history. This modern data mining and analytics is really a very short blip on the screen of the bar of human history. It's just, we haven't needed it. There are other ways, like actually talking to each other, eyewitness testimony. When there was that really bad murder of that young woman on BART, we were right in the middle of our surveillance ordinance project with them. This was before the vote happened, and they tried to rush through this $40 million mass surveillance expansion program. Like, if we just would have had more cameras and facial recognition, we would have caught the guy. They caught the guy because they put his photo on the TV, just like they've been doing for 50 years, and somebody identified him. So it's a false premise to say that we can only solve problems with the newest, best, most cutting edge technology. It's not true. And again, it's the overall picture, because if it is used there and it's used successfully, it's going to spread to another use. And if it's used there successfully, it's going to go to another. And then it becomes ubiquitous. And at that point, we get that radical shift in power between the government and the governed. And we can't go back. You can't unring the bell. Once that shift happens, this is unalterable. That is a concern. And I don't wear a tin hat. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I haven't had to make these types of arguments with other technologies in the past. This one is different. It is too powerful and too radical. And so, I know that would be a very difficult situation to be in, that hypothetical. And people always blame privacy activists and other activists whenever there's a tragedy. We needed, if we would have had the Patriot Act before 9/11, everything would have been fine. It hasn't done anything. And whenever there's an emergency, they take away our civil liberties. I'm always the one that has to back away from my position. I'm always the one that has to assert my rights less. I'm always the one that has to compromise. It never goes the other way. It never goes the other way. That's why we're pushing back, because it is time to start of asserting ourselves, to assert our rights, that there is too much surveillance equipment out in this world already. We don't need more of it.
So do you think that we already have because you're talking about catching criminals after the fact with the technologies we already have, that, putting images on TV, et cetera. I guess what I'm talking about is preventing terrible acts. Do you think that we have what we need to do that without facial recognition technology?
No, we need a whole nother podcast to talk about predictive policing. If that's where you're going, predictive policing, that is just as terrifying. It's bogus. Um, that's just going to be the greatest multiplier of civil liberties abuses, because now a computer is telling me that there is a criminal at XYZ location. Well, when I show up, I'm going to suspect that every single person there is a criminal. I'm going to treat them like criminals. And imagine a police department like Oakland with 16 years of federal monitoring and racial profiling having that technology. Of course, the computer is going to tell them to go out to East Oakland, and then they're going to go out there and everybody's going to get profiled, and it's just going to be a civil liberties nightmare. But the computer told me I had to come here, so now I got to justify it. I've got to get an arrest. So I'm going to look for any little nickel and dime violation, and I'm going to get that data point, and I'm going to go back and feed my computer. Now that computer is going to have even more evidence of crimes occurring in that neighborhood, and it's going to send me right back there. So those same communities that have been getting over-policed are going to get even greater allocation of police resources shoved down their throat. And that's what I keep saying when I say that surveillance doesn't impact all of us equally. There are going to be communities that consent to having a wall of surveillance around them. You see it out here in the Bay Area. We've got this nice little rich enclave, Piedmont, that Oakland surrounds. They've got a wall of license plate readers that ring every single road that connects with Oakland. They're terrified of Oakland. We're the angry mob with pitchforks coming to rob their mansions. And so they've got all this surveillance equipment everywhere. There are going to be communities like that. It doesn't make the world safer. The efficacy of this stuff, it's not there. But the effect of civil liberties abuses, the chilling effect, that's there. We can demonstrate that. And so we really, I want to change this whole narrative. This whole narrative needs to be changed. The messaging needs to be changed. And I think once people get better educated and more fully informed, I'm hopeful that smart people will come to the right conclusions.
Well, you're certainly in the process of changing that narrative right now. And we've been just so honored to have you on the show today. Take so much of your time away from your work to sit down and explain a lot of these complicated and important concepts. As far as changing the narrative goes, maybe we should end on that note. You've touched on it previously in our discussion today. If it's not about privacy, what is it about, Brian?
I think it's all of our First Amendment rights. I think that's why privacy isn't expressly mentioned like it is in the California Constitution. It's so obvious that you cannot have freedom of religion or speech or expression or association or without privacy, right? Somewhere I had to form that idea that led to my expression or my speech. Somewhere I had to have privacy to form that friendship or that association in the first place, or freedom of conscience to, explore a religion. That's why I think privacy is not mentioned, because it's the basis of all those freedoms. Facial recognition will obliterate those. When we've already seen through other surveillance equipment, like, NYPD training cameras directly on the front doors of mosques, license plate readers circling, the NAACP and other activist events. In the old days, you had to infiltrate a group. Now I can just collect your data from sitting outside or using a cell phone tracker to see who's got the cell phones inside the meeting. I just click a button and I could pull all the data on you, and I could build a profile, with Thomson Reuters People Map and Facebook social graphs and all these things. I could see who your friends and your relatives are. That's where the harm is. And folks need to understand that.
Right. And we haven't even mentioned DNA in this podcast here today, but that all factors in too.
I mean, there's, all these people that, want to figure out their family trees, and I totally understand that. And it's actually really interesting and revealing. And again, just as a history nerd, I mean, it's pretty amazing some of the things they found out. And now, of course, with all that information, that treasure trove, and that's just the whole thing about data collection. If it exists, law enforcement's going to go get it. With smart cities, this trend's only going to get worse. So everybody that's voluntarily turning over their DNA, to 23andMe, well, now you're exposing all your family members to the same profiling and threats. And yes, did we, we caught that serial rapist in California. There's going to be success cases, but again, you've now entered your family into a database that the federal government can access, and they're not always so friendly to civil liberties.
Yes, and we did at least a couple of episodes of This Week in Law that touched on people who had been dragged into that kind of scrutiny because their relatives had done 23andMe or Ancestry. So it is an interesting world we are living with. I am glad that we are living with Brian Hofer in it, doing the work that you're doing, Brian, and having such a careful and considered and well thought out approach to the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Triangulation. Let's once again mention Secure Justice. Tell us more about, this is a nonprofit that you are the chair of, correct?
Yeah, so I'm, my goal for 5 years. So for 5 years, I've been doing unpaid activism, hundreds of hours a month, and not such a young man anymore. So I just want to have one job, and so we formed a nonprofit. I formed, I've got an awesome board of other superstar activists that I've been working with for the same, 4 to 5 years. And, the beginning part of our mission statement, it's about combating state abuse of power. And so whether that's, targeting contracting policies like our sanctuary projects, targeting surveillance, abuses, mass incarceration, prosecutor misconduct, that's going to be the new focus. And so I'm really excited about it. I've got a great team, and, it'll be nice to have one job.
It's always nice to have one job, or at least one area that you can apply your main focus. How can people support Secure Justice?
Yeah, so we just did a real little soft launch. They can contact us through the website, secure-justice.org that you just showed on the screen. Thank you, I appreciate that. My email address and everything's up on there, so they can contact us. We're on Twitter at Secure Justice, Facebook at Secure Justice, so they can find us on social media as well.
Wonderful. Anything else you want to leave us with as we conclude the show today?
Just my great appreciation for allowing us to talk about our work in the Bay Area, and with your audience, hopefully it raises awareness.
I'm sure that it has. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us on Triangulation.
Thank you. We're
so glad that you were able to join us today here on Triangulation. We record this show live every Friday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can watch live with us then at twit.tv/live. If you can't listen with us live, don't worry. You can always subscribe to the show wherever and however you like to enjoy your audio-visual entertainment. You can go to twit.tv/triangulation to find out all of the ways you can enjoy the show on your own time at your leisure. That's twit.tv/triangulation. I'm Denise Howell, and we thank you again for joining us today on Triangulation.